Alright, so we've been doing partitioning like this for a long time. As Microsoft began to look at new technologies, they had to veer from this procedure. So this is what we did historically for all operating systems for the last 20 years. And then with the advent of XP, Microsoft had to begin to do some different things. So let's follow from XP to Vista to Windows 7 and then Windows 8. And we'll see that Microsoft is going to be changing some things. And this is about partitioning. So what did Microsoft begin to do? Well, Microsoft introduced in the world of XP a new partitioning technology called dynamic disks. So here's our hard drive. And we have been partitioning drives the same way for the last 20 years. And Microsoft came out with a new technology called dynamic disk partition. The problem was when we put the master boot record here at sector 0, this was the MBR, then we used all the rest of the space for our active partition or our C drive. You could not convert this to a dynamic disk. So Microsoft began to do this. They began to reserve a chunk of the hard disk, and it was unusable. And I believe, I'm trying to remember, it was about 8 megs. So every time you installed Windows XP and you looked at your disk management, you always saw this 8 meg partition. And you wondered, why do I have, and then the rest of the hard drive, we do it this way, the rest of the hard drive was C. Okay, so the rest of the space, so your partition table would show how many partitions?
3.
2. The first was the reserved partition, and it was about 8 megs in size, and then the rest of the hard drive would be considered the active partition, yes? Mm-hmm. And so this is what you saw. Every time you installed XP, you saw a little 8 meg partition, and then you saw the C drive. The reason why Microsoft reserved a little bit and created a second partition was because if you wanted to repartition the hard drive in what's known as a dynamic disk, let me show you what I'm talking about. So, in the old days, we partitioned disks, and I don't want to go too much into this. So this is Disk Administrator. This is my computer management console. And you can see I have how many partitions?
2.
2 partitions. This particular hard drive, disk 0, is partitioned in what is known as dynamic partitioning, dynamic disk. This is a Microsoft proprietary partitioning scheme. We're going to go into a bunch of them. We're going to look at partitioning with what we call basic partitioning, dynamic partitioning. You never knew you had so much. GPT partitioning, and many others. And basically, partitioning is preparing the disk for data. In order to do dynamic partitioning, if I use the entire hard drive up, I couldn't do it. And Microsoft wanted you all to start partitioning your disks with dynamic partitioning. So the only way that it could do that is it had to take a chunk of your hard drive, whether you wanted to or not. You didn't get to choose. It just did it. And it took 8 megs and said, you can't touch this. And that 8 megs was reserved so that you would have space to run what's called a dynamic disk partition. Let's go back here. So just in case you woke up one morning and said, you know what? I want to turn my hard drive into a dynamic disk. You know, we all do that. We wake up some morning and it just hits us. Yes, I've been missing out. I don't want a basic disk. I want a dynamic disk. Yes? Yes, we do that all the time. So just in case, Microsoft created a reserved partition, and then it gave you the rest of the hard drive for your C drive. So when we install XP, we always get how many partitions? 2. Now, Microsoft does provide, if you use the AIK kit, the Automated Installation Kit, a lot of you have been doing the AIK. Raise your hand if you've done AIK yet. This makes sense now, right? So AIK, we can say, no, I don't want that. Yes? You can. Because the AIK allows you to create an answer file that during installation, it will do it just the way you want it. Yes? But if I pop in the CD and I say, let's let Microsoft do it, that really came out with this idea of 2 partitions every time we install, whether you like it or not. And that 8 meg partition was reserved primarily so that there would be space. You needed this space so it could repartition the hard drive into a dynamic disk. Which, by the way, nobody ever did. Nobody ever changed their hard drive to a dynamic disk. Just go right here, right mouse click, and you could convert to different formats, and one of them, yeah, I'm sorry. It does help if you get to see.
It was interruption.
All right, we're back?
Yes.
All right, so you would simply go to your disk. If you woke up that one morning and said, wow, I want a dynamic disk for my laptop or whatever, you would go to the computer management console, you'd go to your disk management, you would right mouse click on the disk. Notice where I'm at. I'm not over here. I'm over here. Yes? I have a different menu over here. Yes? So over here on, I would right click and it would say convert to dynamic disk. And you would be so happy and so excited, it would do it, and absolutely no change would ever happen. You'd be so disappointed. Because it really didn't do anything. All right, so that began the first foray into multiple partitions. Do you think Microsoft is going to stop this? Oh no, we're going to see this a lot. So this was the world of XP, yes? So this was XP, and it was designed for dynamic disk. So every time we installed using the Microsoft disk, it automatically created a reserved partition. When Microsoft decided to launch Vista, a number of new technologies were coming out. So Microsoft started doing some new things. Number one, it began to create a system partition. Listen carefully because I'm going to really do heavy damage to you. Then it's going to create a boot partition. In Vista, this was 100 megabytes. 100 megs. Now listen to me very, very carefully. Microsoft wanted to create 2 partitions because it was beginning to introduce some new technologies. One of them was total hard drive encryption. The ability to totally encrypt a hard drive, which was growing more and more important as people were stealing laptops at the airport, stealing laptops that are left in the taxi cab back seat, and there was all kinds of problems where data was being exposed to the wrong hands, and so there was a push from the customer that Microsoft build some technologies that would allow us to encrypt the entire hard drive. So Microsoft, with the advent of Vista, began to incorporate extra space and create 2 critical partitions. One is called the system partition. Now I'm really going to mess with your mind. And then it's going to create the boot partition. Which one do you think are bigger? Just by my drawing. Where do you think Windows, the operating system, is at?
The boot? System.
Where do you think the boot files are at?
System.
Yeah.
Well,
Yes. Yes, no, Mr. Brown, they wouldn't do that. Oh, yes, they would. So Microsoft decided in their genius to put in the system partition boot files. This is where we boot the operating system. This is actually what?
System.
C root.
This is the C drive. Mr. Interval, what? All right. This one is going to have Windows. This is where all your Windows files, this is where all your files are at. And what partition is it in?
Partition.
You say, Mr. Vanderpool, that's backwards. Yes, it is. But that's the way it is. This is the Microsoft way. So when we talk about the boot partition, we are always talking about the partition that contains the operating system. Does that make any sense? You should say no, because it doesn't. Okay? The system partition is the partition that contains the what files? Now, and when we boot, listen carefully, when we boot, this is the what drive letter?
C.
This has to be C. You have to boot to C. I know I'm blowing your mind. All right, it's going to get better. So, here is where the boot sector is. And all the files that are needed to start the boot process are in the what partition?
System.
And Windows is in the what? Now that is very funky and strange. Let me show you this. So this all began with Vista. Now, before I go any further, there was a number of reasons why notice this partition grew in size. And it now is not just a reserved partition just for dynamic disk, but this size grew much larger from 8 megs to 100 megs. This was so that we could do things like BitLocker. So we could boot the system on this partition and have our unencryption files, all the files that we need to encrypt and decrypt this portion of the hard drive, had to have a larger space so that we could get more information, more software inside this system partition. Okay? So if you wanted BitLocker, if you wanted to encrypt your hard drive, you had to have a lot more software in here in order to boot, decrypt this hard drive, because this is the one that's decrypting, and then boot the system up. Yes? Are we getting fun? Now, and I'll get to you in just a second. Also, by putting my boot files away from the user, all my critical boot files are now over here. I'm going to hide this whole partition from John, Billy, Bob, Auntie, Joe, Uncle. They're never going to see this once Windows boots up. And I'll show you what we're going to do. How do we do that? We're going to boot up with C drive, then we're going to run Windows, and then we're going to go back and make this invisible. What does that do to secure the boot process? It makes it much harder for the users to do what? Damage the boot process. So it adds complexity for you, because you got to understand this. But it adds protection, and we don't have as many boot problems. Because we're going to put all the critical boot files over here, and they will never, ever even touch that partition. Sound good? Let's go take a look. This is Windows 8.1, and it's a little bit different. I'll get into 8.1, but let's go take a look. I want you to look very carefully at the disk 0. What do you see?
The system surface is bigger.
Which partition is system? Right? Which partition is boot? Yes? So this holds what? This holds all the Windows files, all my operating system. This is called System Reserved. This is the system partition. And notice in 8.1, it's bumped up to what? 350 megabytes. It's no longer 100, which was in Vista. Then it went to about 200 in Windows 7, and it's went up to 350 in Windows 8. So we're putting more software in this boot partition. Let's go take a look at that boot partition. Now, I won't show you right away how to do this, but normally, do you ever see this? No, you don't ever get to see it. So I have made it available for us to go view. So here's my partition that you don't rarely ever get to see. Everyone see it?
Yes.
That's what's inside. Notice the first file inside the boot partition. What is the first file in the boot partition? Boot Manager. That's the file that runs Vista, Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 8.1. That's the first file. And notice, you say, well, Mr. Edward, well, wait a minute, that's in what drive? E. I'm going to explain that in a minute. I have given it a drive letter, but normally it doesn't even have a drive letter. I'm going to explain this in a minute. But this, originally, when every day, listen, every time I boot this machine, this drive letter goes back to what? C. And then Windows goes back and changes it to E because I've asked it to. Normally, you don't ever get to see this. This is the boot partition. This is the system partition where the boot files are. And I realize that is so funky. It's like, why'd they do that? Just to confuse us? I guess so. Now, let's go look in our system partition where our boot files are. I love this. And I want you to look in there. See that folder? That's called the recovery folder. And inside that is a WinRE operating system. This is the operating system that you boot to when you have problems with Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 8.1. It's called the repair operating system. And we're going to get into that. And that's where it's at. It's right in there. So that special little WinRE Wim is a file. How many did AIK? You've already seen Wim files, haven't you? That's right. On the CD, there's the install Wim, and that is the file that's used to install Windows, yes? Absolutely. Here's another Wim file, and this is going to be used to boot the machine and allow you to repair the operating system or run memory diagnostics or other things. What else is in the, in this case, the most critical folder is called the boot folder, and in it, everyone see that file? That's called the bcd.dat, and I'm going to get into this more in depth. The bcd.dat is found in the boot directory, and it's called the bcd.dat, and this is a database that tells Windows how to locate the other partition, how to find Windows and get Windows started. So this is a database that's very critical. We know that Boot Manager is the first file that launches the operating system. Now, I have deliberately given this partition a drive letter so that we can go and look at it. But when you go out to your home or look at your laptop, you'll see it. It will be system reserved, and it will have no drive letter, and you won't be able to access it. Because do we want people to access it? No, we don't want people there. Now, let's talk about the fun. Just to give you an idea of how your Windows boots pretty well. So, how do we do this? How do we boot to this partition? But after Windows loads up, Windows Initially, this partition here is called the system partition. This is given the drive letter of C. Once the boot process begins, it finds this partition over here. It says, oh, here's the operating system. Let's begin to boot the operating system. As the operating system begins to boot up, it says, look, I need that drive letter. So give it to me. This becomes what?
C drive.
This one becomes nothing. Sometimes you will see this, actually this becomes, the drive letter is transferred to this partition. But you booted off this partition.
As a way to hide it.
As a way to hide it. Now, the main reason why we did all this fancy stuff is because of BitLocker, because of full hard drive encryption. If I need to encrypt the entire volume, this is the one that contains the user's data, true?
Yes.
This is the one I want to encrypt. Do I care if you get boot manager?
No.
You steal my laptop and you steal boot manager file, I could care less. So this is why Microsoft had to design a two-partition system. This software on here allows us to boot, and then if you've got BitLocker installed, it will have additional software that will start to unencrypt this partition. And you boot up normally. So if you steal my laptop, you may be able to see and read all the files that are in here, yes? Because this is not going to be encrypted. But if you steal my laptop and you look at this partition, this will look like gibberish because it will be highly encrypted. Yes?
So if the boot, if the boot in the system partition contains the files to decrypt Windows, couldn't you still decrypt Windows with the boot? Just using the boot?
When we turn on BitLocker, we go to Control Panel. And we say, I want to encrypt my hard drive. You are turning on what?
BitLocker.
So when you go to Control Panel, it says, you know what, I'm really freaking out. I got my laptop, I got my tax returns, I got my social security number on my laptop. I am really worried. I would like to encrypt my hard drive. You go to Control Panel, you decide to encrypt your hard drive. Then what happens is they move special software over here, and then they begin the process of encrypting your entire hard drive. There has to be software over here to unencrypt it, yes?
Yes.
And so that software is then moved. That's why this space has grown from 100 megs in Windows Vista to 200 megs in Windows 7, and now 350 in Windows 1.1. Because we have to move software over to do this encryption decryption. Does that answer your question? Questions? Yes, I want you to ask questions.
Since they can't touch that partition, could you then make it bigger and add files, let's say kind of like what companies do with cell phones, adding bloatware?
I'm going to get into that. We're going to talk about recovery partitions, okay? All right. So let me finish. Let's quickly look at, so this is Vista. So Vista reserved on their system partition, and then the boot partition. Let's take a look at, as we move down. So let's make a column. So Vista did 100 megs, and then the rest was left, the rest of the hard drive was left for the boot partition. In Windows 7, it went to 200 megs, and the rest of the hard drive was left for the boot partition. With Windows 8 and 8.1, we're now at 350 megs, and the rest of the hard drive is left for the boot partition. Everybody there? We swap drive letters on the fly. This partition will always be what during the boot process? C. And it is the active partition. This is always the boot active partition, as small as it is. And then once the boot process begins, we come over to this partition, we swap drive letters, we give it the C drive letter, and then we boot up the rest of the way. All right, so let's talk about what you typically see in the real world. So that's Microsoft, that's just Microsoft. So here's often what you're going to see. You're going to see this. Let's take a laptop from Acer. You got an Acer laptop. This is what you're going to see. You're going to see the system partition. Then you're going to have an OEM. And this is typically called the recovery partition. And then you're going to have the boot partition. So, what is that for? Why do you see it on almost every PC that you'll deal with? If you buy a typical PC, period, I don't care from who, this is what you're going to see on the hard drive. Why? What is this for? What do users do to their PCs all the time? They mess them up. They get viruses, they load software, they mess them up, don't they? So almost every vendor puts an entire copy of the operating system right here. So when you run the Acer and it's acting up strange and you call Acer for technical support, they'll say go to programs and click on recovery. And they'll double click on recovery and all of a sudden their laptop reboots and guess what? They're starting the install of what? And it blows this all away and they get everything just like it was brand new. Yes? Has anyone ever experienced that?
Yeah.
Yes. This is where the entire original operating system is kept. Their applications, that whatever came with that laptop or desktop is saved in that partition. The OEM builds a way for you to access it. And what it will do is it will allow them to totally reinstall the entire operating system so they have a brand new, just like the day they bought it. With all their bloatware and all their junkware and all their garbage that they get whether they like it or not. So it is it's very common to find 3 partitions on a very typical consumer product. You'll have an OEM partition, and this is where your entire fresh copy of the operating system is stored. And so that when the user calls for support or the user decides on their own to reinstall Windows, it launches them into this partition and they just reinstall Windows all over again. All right, what happens when the hard drive gets hosed? All right, I lose the whole hard drive. What happens to the recovery?
It's gone.
It's gone. Or Joe Friend comes over, okay? Joe Friend comes over, and he brings his Windows 7 installation DVD, and he pops it in, and he says, "What is that? They're taking part of your hard drive. How dare them? Let's erase all those partitions and I'll put Windows in it." Yes?
Yes.
Oh yeah, they do it all the time. And then your friend blows away your entire hard drive, including your OEM, and then you get it up, you got Windows 7, you say, well, where's my other stuff? So it's very common to see 3 partitions on hard drives today. One is called the OEM Reserve. Levino, Acer, everybody does it. Everybody does it. If you buy a computer from Dell, you buy a computer from HP, it's going to have a reserve partition